Welcome. Today, I'll talk about the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2024 awarded to Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. And why is it interesting? This is probably the most talked about economics Nobel in recent times that has sharply divided public opinion and also generated a meme fest on social media. I will explore what makes their work so impactful, the real world problems that it tries to address, and why it matters to each of us, whether we are students of economics or just curious about the world that we live in. So let's dive in. Mughal India, Aztec and Inca civilizations in South America in 1500 were much richer than North America, Canada, and Australia at that time. But after colonization, there was a reversal of fortunes. Canada, Australia, North America became much more prosperous than South America and India. This provided a mechanism for Acemoglu and his co-authors to understand why rich countries are rich and poor countries are poor. And this is one of the fundamental questions in economics, to know why rich countries are rich and can poor countries catch up with them. Now, what about colonization? Economists call this kind of a phenomena as a quasi-experiment or a natural experiment. Colonization played out in colonies differently. So Acemoglu and his co-authors, in short, we will call them AJR, say that colonizers created good institutions in some colonies and bad institutions in other colonies. So those colonies where the colonizers created good institutions, which they call inclusive institutions, they went on to determine good economic outcomes or high per capita income eventually in those countries. Whereas the other colonies where colonizers created bad institutions that AJR called extractive institutions became countries where per capita income was much, much lower in subsequent years. The key idea of AJR's work is that countries with good or inclusive institutions are more prosperous than those countries which have bad or extractive institutions. Now, what are institutions? Institutions are rules of the game, a definition that was given by Douglas North, himself a Nobel Prize in Economics winner in 1993. North referred to institutions as rules of the game that provide incentives for human exchange. So think of institutions as rules or laws and regulations, protection of property rights, governance, the way in which economic exchange is organized in the country based on the laws of the land and how the country is governed. AJR defined good institutions or inclusive institutions as those that enforce property rights for broader segments of the population and incentivize investments. These institutions allow majority of the population to have a say in governance. Simply think of democracies. AJR referred to bad institutions as those which are extractive in nature, meaning the rule of law and property rights are absent for the vast majority of the population. These extractive institutions are more likely to occur when power resides in the hands of a narrowly defined elite. Now, think of the role that institutions play in prosperity of a country. AJ are not the first ones to identify this. Douglas North, Danny Roderick, Tim Beasley, La Porta, etc., they have referred to the role of institutions much before. So then why did AJR win the Nobel Prize in Economics this year? AJR have demonstrated the same idea with elegant statistical rigor. They have showed that history matters for economic outcomes of nations, and they made macro view of development mainstream, which was not the case before their work. And as I said before, they have created a wide interest in this kind of work and therefore created a big impact on the literature and public opinion. So let's ask the fundamental question: what drives economic growth of a country? It is well known in economics that labor and capital are important ingredients of long run growth and prosperity. So, by labor, we mean the number of workers who are working in the economy, the quality of the workforce, which economists call human capital. Think of it as health and education. Physical capital, machines, equipments, tool, land, and technology are drivers of economic growth. Then there is another set of experts who refer to the role of geography, climatic conditions, distance from the equator. So such experts argue that if a country is hot, maybe it has lower productivity of the workers and therefore it will lead to lower economic outcomes. Or tropical countries will have more prevalence of infectious diseases, which reduces productivity of the labor and therefore will lead to lower GDP per capita. There's another set of experts who emphasize the role of institutions that encourage investments by providing incentives. institutions that encourage entrepreneurship, occupational choice, the freedom to choose what occupation I will follow, protection of property rights, encouragement of innovation and technology. And then finally, there are informal institutions, things like societal culture, social capital, values of the people, beliefs of the population, religions, etc., can also determine economic prosperity. Now, AJR focuses on economic institutions. Now, does economic institutions really matter for prosperity of countries? AJR referred to a small natural experiment. Think of the Korean Peninsula. Korea was, before World War II, one country. Both Koreas had the same people, same land, same natural resources, similar temperature, similar levels of education and development. Then what happened? They were split. The north became communist, the south became capitalist, although authoritarian, because we know it was ruled by a military ruler, General Park, till it became a democracy in 1980. But this split of the two Koreas led to very different economic paths for the two of them. The north, that followed a socialist and communist path, became poorer, whereas the south, that chose a capitalist model and later on became a democracy, became much more prosperous. If you look at the nightlight view of the two Koreas, it's very stark how the economic destinies of the two have become so different, of countries that were actually one at one point of time. So, how do AGR prove that good institutions lead to good economic outcomes or higher per capita income? One could argue that it's the other way around. High per capita income, in fact, leads to creation of good institutions such as democracy and protection of property rights. So, this question is not easy to answer. So, AJR's empirical strategy is to go back in history and look at the kind of institutions that the colonizers created. So AGR argues that today's economic outcomes or per capita income of a country is determined by today's institutions. And today's institutions are the child of the institutions that have persisted for hundreds of years, which means the early institutions during the time of colonization has played an important role in the formation of today's institutions. And the institutions at the time of colonizations were created by the colonizers, and depending on whether the colonizers chose to settle down in a country or chose to extract, exploit, and take the wealth back to their own country, that choice determined what kind of institutions the colonizers created in the colonies. So AJR look at the settler mortality data at the time of colonization, which means when the colonizers arrived to the potential colony, what is the probability that they would survive? So if the mortality is high because they would die of maybe malaria or yellow fever, then they would not like to settle down in such a country. So they would exploit, extract, and take out the wealth. And to enable them to do that, they created bad institutions or extractive institutions. But when they came to potential colonies, which had lower mortality rates for the settlers so that they would not die, the colonizers chose to settle down in such countries such as Canada, USA, and Australia, and created good institutions or inclusive institutions that continued and survived to have good institutions even today, causing high per capita income in those countries. So, this strategy of choosing a historical phenomena as a way out to resolve the potential reverse causality that I posed before you is known as the instrumental variable approach in econometrics. So, AJR's brilliance is to use settler mortality of the colonizers as an instrumental variable to resolve the issue of does institutions matter for economic prosperity. What AJR have told us is that inclusive institutions create prosperity of nations, extractive institutions make countries poor. Now, does it mean that the institutions are predetermined by their colonial past and cannot be changed, and therefore poor countries can never become rich? AJR do not say that. In fact, AJR specifically say that if we improve institutions, then economic prosperity will follow. And this powerful conclusion comes from their research where they show that institutions does matter. So therefore, AGR are not saying that economic outcome is destiny and cannot be changed. They are in fact saying that go ahead and improve the quality of your institutions, per capita income will improve. Now, what about China? China seems to be doing very well in terms of economic progress, even though it is ruled in an authoritarian manner. So AGR admit that authoritarian growth is possible, as China seems to demonstrate, but AGR predicts that such growth is unsustainable. What about India? So, in case of India, I believe that democracy is our core advantage, and AJR's work shows that democratic countries are going to have higher per capita income compared to non-democratic countries. Now, AJR's work has been severely criticized. So, one of the main criticisms has been that they propose a Eurocentric view of development, as if it is the colonizers who created good institutions and only that is the path to development. But I think that's a misreading of AJR's work. They do not credit colonizers for every kind of development that has happened. All they are saying is that colonizers have created good institutions and created bad institutions. So, they are as much to be credited as to be blamed for the current differences in economic outcomes across countries. So, what do you think? How much of an impact do institutions play on economic prosperity of countries? What role did the colonizers play in the economic destinies of the colonies? And what else would you like me to talk about in this podcast? Let me know in the comments below.